and welcome to a new episode of MELT. I'm Ritvika Gupta, shooting from home. This week, we are once again revisiting a session from ZeeMELT 2021. We'll be taking a look at a session by writer, speaker, and coach Richard Holman. As a creative director, Richard has led high-profile advertising and design projects for many leading entertainment brands. His provocative and entertaining session today, titled Counterintuitive Creative Thinking, will dash through 300,000 years of human history to derive 7 lessons on original thinking for the present and future. Let's get ready to melt with Richard Holman.
It's tempting, I think, as human beings to assume that the point we're at today is the acme of human civilization. It's kind of the peak of our knowledge, and everything we understand to be true is indeed true. But I'm not so sure. I think if you begin to delve around a little into how we arrived here, to explore our history as a species, you start to realize that some of the truths we take for granted today maybe aren't quite as true as we might think. And so it is about creativity. Often, I think our assumptions about the best way to have ideas are just plain wrong. So I'd like you to join me on this journey through 300,000 years of human history to overturn some common perceptions about the creative process. We live in a culture of presenteeism. We've never worked as hard as we do today. Our hours are longer than ever before. And there is this assumption, the harder you work, the better your ideas will be. Well, what if this isn't quite true? What if the harder you work, the worse your ideas will be? This is one of the most famous paintings of all time. It is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. And it occupies a fresco, a wall in a church in Milan. And there's an interesting story behind the genesis of this painting. Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned at great expense to come and paint this scene on the wall of the church in Milan. When Leonardo received the commission, he would arrive each morning at the church and look up at the wall that was to take his painting. And then he would go walk around the garden, having never lifted a brush. And this went on for a couple of weeks. And the prior in charge of the church started to get a little bit edgy. And he said to Leonardo, "Dude, we've paid you a lot of money." Leonardo turned to the prior, looked him hard in the eye and said, "Those of lofty genius sometimes accomplish the most when they work the least." And Leonardo understood something to be true that many innovators and great creatives have down the years. When Einstein was stuck with a tricky mathematical problem, he would step away from his desk and play the violin. Einstein called it combinatory play. To uncover an original solution, a really breakthrough, innovative solution, you have to take time to step away from the problem. Neuroscientists have begun to investigate this, and they've discovered that there are 2 modes of thought, analytic and spontaneous. So analytic is an active process. It's the kind of thinking that we do when we're consciously thinking about thinking. We sit down and go, right, I need to think about this problem. Spontaneous thought is passive and unconscious. It happens when we're not trying to think. Analytic is a top-down process. It's coordinated by our prefrontal cortex, the executive center of our brain. Spontaneous is bottom-up. Our brain networks together in surprising ways. Analytic is incremental. It will take you step by step through a problem, but those steps will only be quite small. Spontaneous gives you brilliant, unpredictable insights that seemingly appear out of nowhere. Analytic gives you access to relatively low processing power in your brain, just a few bits every second, whereas spontaneous thinking enables the vast processing power of your brain. And it's spontaneous thinking where the really great insights come from. The word inspiration literally means to take a deep breath, to chill out. And both Leonardo and Einstein were deliberately chilling out as part of their process. I think about it a bit like vegetable soup. So I'm currently in my kitchen here in Wales, and around this time of year, I like to go out in the garden, pick a few vegetables, pick some herbs, chop them all up, stick them on a pot on the cooker, and go off and do something else. And when I've come back, I've got this delicious vegetable broth. And I think so it is with ideas. One must fill one's head with the problem, absorb the brief if there is one, and then go away and do something else. And then you will have access to this incredible power of spontaneous thinking. It's why ideas, the best ideas, sometimes come to us when we're in the shower or we're going for a walk. So me, I like to go for a run in the mountains in South Wales where I live. Margaret Atwood, the writer, creator of The Handmaid's Tale, says walking leads to rumination, rumination leads to poetry. Indeed, there was a recent survey I read that said you are 60% more creative when you're walking than sitting down. So I'd encourage you to find your thing, the thing that enables you to relax, acquire that still state of mind for spontaneous ideas to come to you. Our next assumption is that one must find the best idea you can. This is what it's all about, isn't it, really? But what if you don't set out to find the best idea you can? What if you set out to find the worst? 1968 in New York, a couple of advertising creatives, Roy Grace and John Noble, received yet another car brief. They seem to get all the car briefs. This brief was for a VW Beetle. And they decided they were getting a bit bored with all these car briefs. So they said, why don't we do this a bit differently? What is the worst possible scenario we can come up with for selling a car? Roy Grace said to John Noble, how about a funeral?
I, Maxwell E. Snavely, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the following. To my wife Rose, who spent money like there was no tomorrow, I leave $100 and a calendar. To my sons, Rodney and Victor, who spent every dime I ever gave them on fancy cars and fast women, I leave $50 in dimes. To my business partner, Jules, whose only motto was spend, 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 I leave nothing, nothing, nothing. And to my other friends and relatives who also never learned the value of $1, I leave $1. Finally, to my nephew Harold, who oft-times said, a penny saved is a penny earned, and who also oft-times said, gee, Uncle Max, it sure pays to own a Volkswagen. I leave my entire fortune of $100 billion.
And so an advertising classic was born. So when you're faced with a difficult creative problem, if you ask yourself, what's the worst possible solution, rather than the best, then two really interesting things happen. The first is that the pressure is off. You're no longer trying to come up with an award-winning idea. You try to come up with a rubbish one. And that's quite fun. It relaxes you. It allows for spontaneous thought to take place. The other thing that happens is that you go somewhere completely unexpected because you're going to a rubbish area and nobody else would go there, would they? And it may be that in hunting for the worst idea, the place you end up is not in and of itself a great idea, but often it can be a really, really fruitful direction and a much better place to begin than putting yourself under a huge amount of pressure and trying to find a brilliant idea. Our third assumption, self-doubt is not always going to be a burden. I think as human beings, we sort of imagine that there is this point in the future where everything is going to be okay. And maybe professionally, where we're at the top of our tree, we've won so many awards that self-doubt is no longer a burden. But what are we going to do if self-doubt is always a burden? This is another of the greatest artworks humanity has ever produced. It is, of course, the Sistine Chapel. When Michelangelo was making this painting, he wrote a letter to his friend. And in that letter, he wrote, "My painting is dead. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." There's a writer, Anne Enright, and she wrote this, which I think is really nice. Only bad writers think that their work is really good. If you have the talent and the acuity to produce an exceptional piece of work in a given genre, that means by definition, you understand that genre perfectly. And if you understand the genre, you are all the more able to see the flaws in your own work. So I think self-doubt's never going to go away. And if self-doubt has disappeared, then you have a problem. So what do we do? Well, Dr. Seuss wrote this beautiful couplet. Today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. And no matter what the demons in our minds are telling us about how pitiful we are and how terrible our work is, I think the thing always to cling on to is that you are solely the person who has your perspective and your experience. And so long as you are true to the vision as you see it and as you are as a human being, and that is the best you can absolutely do. And that is the best path to producing authentic work. The next assumption that we often labor under is that creativity is additive. After all, we're bringing something into the world which didn't previously exist. We are adding form and light and color and text. So surely creativity is all about adding. Well, what if the most creative thing you can do is not to add, but to take things away? The filmmaker Louis Buñuel says every object conceals another. Every word in your script, every character is in a scene has the potential to obscure another. The fewer there are, the stronger they become. When you're writing a script, is every word earning its keep? Is it doing a job? If it's not, it's diluting your message. A great creative hero of mine is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He wrote Le Petit Prince. He was an aviator, a designer, a writer. He said, a designer knows he's achieved perfection, not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Nobody has put this better, I think, than the artist Marina Abramovich. She describes the creative process as more and more of less and less, more and more of less and less. I think that is really all we're trying to do, to amplify our core message with as few instruments as possible. Accidents are bad, right? You know, we're taught from the time we're a kid, accidents are bad. Avoid accidents at all costs. But what if accidents in the creative process aren't bad? What if accidents are actually very good? Here is a photograph, one of the most famous photographs of all time, and it was taken on Christmas Eve, just before 10:30 a.m. Houston time in 1968. The Apollo 8 mission was the first mission to orbit the moon, and the astronauts on board had been given a strict schedule of images to photograph. They were there to photograph the surface of the moon. This was their job. On the fourth orbit of the moon, the commander of the spaceship, Frank Borman, rotated the ship just a little bit. And his colleague, Bill Anders, saw this scene before you. He saw the blue pearl of Earth rising above the grey, lifeless surface of the moon. And though it was contrary to the schedule, he fired off a couple of exposures with his Hasselblad camera. And then he went back to photographing the moon as instructed. When the astronauts returned to Earth, this photograph became a sensation. It was the first time as a species we'd ever really appreciated how fragile and beautiful our planet is up there in the vastness of space. And many people say that this was when the environmental movement really began. And had Bill Anders been so obsessed with his objective that he had stuck to it, then this moment would not have happened at this point in human history. And these little gifts of the creative process are where the magic really happens. And they often come in spite of ourselves. And if you are responsive to these gifts, then the work can become bigger than you. So I think the trick is to be mindful when you make. It's absolutely fine to have an objective, to be heading towards a goal, but not to be so fixated on it that you don't notice when something really interesting is happening over here. Often that is where the gifts come from the creative gods, the things that you couldn't predict. Stealing is bad. And yes, again, something that we're taught as kids. But what if stealing isn't bad? What if stealing is good? This is a band. They're called the Winstons. Not many people have heard of them, but the Winstons have played a huge role in contemporary music. In summer 1969, they were recorded in a recording studio in Atlanta, and they laid down a track called Colour Him Father. And they were pleased with this track. In fact, it would go on to be their biggest selling hit and win their Grammy. But they had a problem, and the problem was what to put on the B-side. They just couldn't think of anything to go on the B-side. So the leader of the band, Richard L. Spencer, said, how about that gospel classic, Amen Brother? So they laid down Amen Brother, but there was a problem. It came up short. So they added a guitar solo, still too short. So the drummer, GC, Gregory Coleman, said, how about I add a drum break? And he did. He played the same beat for 2 bars, delayed the snare in the third, left the first beat of the 4th bar open before finishing with a syncopated flourish and an early crash cymbal. That sounds quite complicated. Maybe it's better if you hear JC's break. But not much more happened after that. The A-side had some success. The Winstons split up and they were consigned to a footnote in recording history. Spool forward now to New York in the early 1980s. And 3 DJs, Kool Herc, African Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash have come up with this new technique of running 2 turntables together to create an infinite loop of tunes. And the thing that they're looking for are clean drum breaks. One of them finds the song by the Winstons and starts to use this drum break a lot. And before long, they're not just the only musicians to pick up on it. Salt and Pepper are the first, the rap outfit to use it in their tune, I Desire. It becomes the backbone of Straight Outta Compton by NWA. It pops up in tunes by The Prodigy, by Carl Cox, the house music DJ, by Oasis, by Amy Winehouse, even by David Bowie. I looked yesterday, I checked on the Who Sampled app. The break from the Winstons has been used over 5,300 tunes. And I tell you this story, not because the Winstons deserve wider recognition, although they've not received any royalties, but because it illustrates, I think, that nothing can come of nothing. There are really no truly original ideas. Let's rewind all the way back now to as far back as we're going to go in this session. For a long time, it was thought that Neanderthals were dull, stupid, brutish creatures. So it came as a bit of a shock in 2018 when scientists discovered that the Neanderthal brain is bigger than the human brain. This was kind of weird, you know. How could it be that they were around for hundreds of thousands of years, but only really came up with arrowheads? Homo sapiens been around for 20,000 years, and we have all this stuff like laptops and Zoom. On further exploration, the scientists discovered that although the Neanderthals' brains are bigger, the cerebellum is smaller. And the cerebellum is the part of the brain that deals with social skills like language processing. And so Neanderthals were rubbish at sharing ideas, and human beings are very good at it. So a Neanderthal tribe, when faced with a problem, would have to begin at the very beginning. As human beings, we build on the achievements of our forebearers. We build as musicians on the achievements of the Winstons. And I think understanding this aspect of creativity can make one much more confident about drawing influences from all over. The trick, the essential thing though, is to take things on. Jean-Luc Godard, the movie director, said it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. To purely imitate something is to copy. It's to be a cannibal. It's to eat your own kind, and cannibalism never ends well. The trick is to be a thief, to take something and make it your own. Final assumption: a mistake is a mistake is a mistake. But what if a mistake isn't always a mistake? Well, there's a lovely parable in Buddhism about a farmer. And the farmer has a horse. And one day his horse escapes. And his neighbour comes over to commiserate. He says, "Man, I'm sorry to hear your horse has gone." And the farmer says, "But who's to say what's bad or good?" And the next day, his horse returns, and it comes back with 6 other horses that it's encountered on the plains, wild horses. So now the farmer has 7 horses. His neighbour congratulates him, and he says, "Who's to say what's bad or good?" And sure enough, the next day, his son is trying to break one of these wild horses. He falls off and breaks his leg. The neighbour commiserates. The farmer says, "Who's to say what's bad or good?" Another day passes and the army are coming through, and they're looking to recruit able-bodied men to fight in the war, but the farmer's son can't go. He's safe. He stays at home. But the point, I hope, is clear. We kid ourselves if we can say at the point at which something happens, that is a mistake. In the longer term, the reality might turn out to be quite different. Mistakes are like weeds, There's no such thing as a weed. It's just a plant that we assume to be something we don't want in the garden, so we call it a weed. So there we go. That's our dash through human history. I hope I've given you some food for thought there. A quick recap. Step away from the problem. Be like Einstein and Da Vinci. Take time to move away, to allow spontaneous thought to happen. Always begin by asking yourself, what's the worst idea? It's a great way to begin a brainstorm. It takes the pressure off. Accept self-doubt. It's never going to go away. It's a good thing that it's there. Just be true to who you are. If you can, think about the creative process as making more and more of less and less, doing more with less. Embrace the magic of accidents. Always be mindful when you make. Don't copy. Never copy. Your creative soul will shrivel and die. Steal. And remember, a mistake isn't always a mistake. If we have a healthy relationship to failure, then we are in a position to make great work great.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And stay updated with all that's happening in the world of advertising and marketing with our daily Melt update on our website, readytomelt.com. I shall see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.